want to talk a little bit about performance, and we're not going to go into like how to tune a query or look at an execution plan or things like that here. But what I want to look at is like the bigger picture things on performance. Does your SQL Server have performance issues? Really, where that comes from usually is somebody complaining about it? Are your website users or your internal customers or whoever uses that SQL Server, are they complaining that things are slow? Is your infrastructure team or your VM team, are they complaining that you're using too much CPU all the time? Are there specific times of the day, or is it slow all of the time? Performance is one of those big things that can go bad quickly, and without the right way to monitor it and to track it and keep up on it, it may just blindside you if you're not ready. Oftentimes, with a little bit of growth, your SQL Server hits a tipping point where what was running great suddenly is completely bogged down. And once it gets to that point, it's a lot harder to resolve it than if we could have caught the issues a little bit earlier. And then relating to performance, are you expecting growth that may lead to performance issues? Now, if your business is a declining business and you have less and less clients and less data every year, maybe growth isn't an issue for SQL Server. But if you're either staying stable with your number of customers or clients or growing over time, well, either of those scenarios, more and more data grows in your SQL Server database. And as those databases get bigger, they can lead to performance and growth issues. And we're going to take a look in a minute here at some ways to track that. But being ready for that is one of those things that we work with and that we can help you with. And the idea is trying to figure out, how do we do that before it's too late? If you're calling and your SQL Server is all down and everyone's screaming and you just brought on your biggest, newest client and it doesn't look good for them, well, that's a lot harder scenario for us to fix. We can help you fix that, but it's a lot easier if we work with you or we have some insight, or even so you know ahead of time that you're at a certain percentage of capacity, and if you add 50% more users or something like that, that you're going to have a problem. It's good to know about that before it happens rather than after it happens. The other side of performance is licensing. Wow, tripping up there. The other side is licensing costs. And are your licensing costs out of control? And one way that we've seen a lot of people deal with performance issues is because hardware relatively is getting cheaper and cheaper, and is, if it's local, is it's getting more expensive in the cloud, of course, but is that a lot of people deal with their performance issues just by adding more CPU, adding more memory, adding more cores, faster cores. And with the Microsoft SQL Server licensing model, that adds significantly to your cost over time. You might get to a scenario where it's prohibitive to add more CPUs to your SQL Server because you're already paying too much for licensing. And that's one of those things. It's good to understand where you're at so we can determine, do we really need to add to your licensing costs, or do you really need to add more cores, or is there some alternative? Can we tune some queries, or is there a way to adjust something so that things run at different times of the day to reduce the load? And that's where we come to performance tools and options. And the most important thing, I think, with performance on your SQL Server is establishing a baseline, knowing where you're at. If somebody says, well, what capacity of your SQL Server CPU load are you running at on an ongoing basis today? Is that something you know? Is that something you can answer? Well, it's a really good thing to be able to answer if you're asking for more allocation of funds, for more server, for more cores, things like that. It's good to know what's happening with your weights. What is slow over time? Is your SQL Server load changing over time? Do you have more queries that are blocking? One client, we work with, they run great, and then they have a little bit of growth or query changes slightly, and they end up with all of a sudden a whole lot of blocking around one specific area. That's where having the right tools in place to know what your level of blocking is. And was this a block that just blocked 2 or 3 queries, or was it a block that blocked 200 or 300 queries or 200 or 300 users? Having those baselines to understand what's going on with your SQL Server is super important. And I'm going to show you some examples of how we can do those here. The other thing is we have a performance and health assessment from Stedman Solutions. With this, we can find and mitigate the issues. That's something we do regularly where we come in and help people. If that's something you want help with, please reach out to me with a contact form at the end. But let's take a look at how we can establish some of these baselines. So this is looking at historic weights, and this is part of the Database Health Monitor application. But what I'm looking at here is weights on my test server. This happens to be my desktop server running SQL 2019. And there's a bit of load here because I've got a bunch of test code running that does a bunch of different processing for performance and blocking testing and all that. But what we're looking at is we're looking at these blue bars over time and how many weights are happening. And usually what I tell people is if you don't want to understand all the detail of this chart, just look at it month over month, and are your blue bars getting bigger over time to the right, or is it staying constant or slightly down? If we look at what we're seeing here with these blue bars, we can see kind of a line across the middle there that shows, if we drew an average line across the middle, we could see that the last couple of weeks have been lower than sometime in April, but that was higher than sometime in early April. So looking at this over time is a good way to see, are things improving or things getting worse in your system? So for instance, if you deploy new code to your server, for instance, if it's in-house code or a new application update, does your weights change over time? We've seen this where somebody deploys a query that's using a new table maybe that they forgot to put indexes on, and we find out suddenly the weights spike, and we can track it down to it's that one table that's the problem, and we can even track it down to the point in time that occurred so that we can come back and track it and figure out how to undo it. So establishing the baseline on weights is super important. The next one is understanding your CPU. This is another report that we have as part of the historic monitoring and database health monitor. And with this, we can go in and look at what your CPU has been doing on average every hour for the last 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks, or even I think it goes back as far as 4 months if you're keeping that much data tracked here. And what we're looking for with this as well is baselines and trends. If you see lines across there where there's like a spike, and we don't see this on this server so much, but like if there's a spike at 2 a.m. where CPU goes up significantly, that can oftentimes be maintenance plans, indexing, check DB, and it might be you look at it and you say, okay, well 2 a.m., not an issue. That's fine for CPU to spike at that point, as long as it doesn't impact people during the day. But if you're on a 24/7 system, that 2 a.m. spike that you never really see because you're not actively using it at that point in time might be really important for those people using your system in a different time zone. What we're seeing here on this specific chart is that there was some stuff going on around May 4th through May 7th where the CPU was a bit higher than usual, and it was running at 24 to 35, kind of in that range, in the green to yellow range. And then before that it was lower, and then after that it was lower, generally in the 7 to 10 to 15% range with kind of the blues and greens. And with the color charting we have here, you can see how is your CPU going over time. If you're looking at this and this is all in the 80s and 90s, well, that tells you need some help there. You either need more CPU, or we need to figure out what's doing that load and figure out how to make that happen with less load. Another important baseline we look at is things like tempDB use by hour. tempDB is one of those things where a lot of queries, a lot of processing, a lot of things from different databases all end up being bottlenecked on tempDB because you only have one tempDB on each SQL server. We find that with this, we can go and see when is that tempDB spiking. And what's interesting is we can see the tempDB load here for when it was, and this is a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the worst. We can see that tempDB on those same days, that if we go back to CPU, same days we saw high CPU, we also saw high tempDB usage there. And then if somebody says, well, gee, my tempDB is running at an 8 or a 9 somewhere, how can I figure out what's going on with that? Well, you can just click on this chart and go in and see that. But really, this is one of those tools that gives you insight on what's happening with your SQL Server, and looking at these charts over time give you the ability to determine, are we improving or are we getting worse? Are we approaching that tipping point where it's just going to go red all the time because it just can't keep up with the I/O or keep up with the processing or the load? Anyway, so that's enough on the performance and the monitoring and tracking. The key here is being able to follow these things so that you know if what you've done has made things better or made things worse. I don't know how often we've seen that somebody tries something and it ends up making their system worse, and then they don't even realize it made it worse. 2 or 3 things that make it worse can take your system down. So this tracking is super important. It's all part of Database Health Monitor, a tool that I've built over the last 13 or 14 years now.